Great. Well, welcome everyone to the transportation session. We have a great panel here. As many of you know, transportation is now the greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States and in many countries in the world, and also one of the fastest growing sources. And for anyone that saw this morning's science presentation, it's clear that we are in dire straits and we need to move quickly. And at the same time, we are entering a period of disruption in the transportation sector, which has the potential to create significant risks in climate as well as benefits. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the implications of that. We are not quite at this scenario yet. This full disclosure, this is the Onion, but this would solve a lot of our problems. But let's move to reality, and we are able to hear from Ethan Zindler from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And Ethan, I'm going to give you this.
Well, hi everybody again, and thanks for this opportunity. We've got a great session. I'm going to try and be relatively quick and share a few outlooks from our team. We have an advanced transportation group that looks specifically at electric vehicles and increasingly at autonomous vehicles and thinking about the future of mobility. We've got about a dozen folks thinking about this globally, and one of the things that we do is try and get into the weeds and understanding things like battery manufacturing capacities in different parts of the world and who's doing it and what the costs are, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Because I would make the argument that the real question is when and how electric vehicles become fundamentally economically competitive on an unsubsidized basis. But there is another aspect to EVs which I want to talk to you about, which is sort of the qualitative aspect, which I'll touch on in just a second. So this is actually our longer-term forecast. Actually, I apologize for the bubble because the number should be a little bit higher, but we think that about half of the cars sold by 2040 will be electric vehicles. And I'll give a little explanation why. I realize that's a bold claim, given that only about 1 million were sold in 2017, with a good deal of geographic distribution, with China playing obviously a very important role. And we're already seeing the Chinese move very quickly towards trying to put in place policies to encourage EV adoption. The main reason why we're optimistic, and my firm's been around for a while doing this, and there's always lots of claims around this technology or that technology. I'm not a PhD in anything having to do with science. I have an MBA. I don't really believe almost ever in major technological breakthroughs, but I am a devout religious believer in economies of scale. And when it comes to lithium-ion batteries, we have seen a very strong decline in the price of these batteries as the market is scaled up to really unprecedented heights. Of course, you read about the Gigafactory out in Nevada from Tesla, but China's got their own factories that are bigger even, that are doing the same. We hear a lot about the Model 3. What you don't hear as much about is the city of Shenzhen is converting their entire bus fleet to electric buses thanks to BYD, and that's a bus fleet larger, I'm told, than Chicago, LA, and New York's bus fleet combined. So there's a lot of stuff happening that's not always as much in the US press, but it's driven by costs. I showed this slide earlier, but a little more detail on it, which is just that our view is that if you assume that you continue to see a learning rate of about 18%, which by the way is a lot slower improvement than we've actually seen, which are those triangles. Let's see if that works. Yeah, kind of, not really. But anyway, those triangles are showing, these are actual prices that we've tracked by surveying buyers and sellers of these batteries. And this is just the line that we plot out going forward. And if that happens, and we think it will, then you start to see a real uptake in the adoption of electric vehicles, including electric buses, and at the top, electric storage on the grid, a very small sliver of that. And that's really what drives that very bullish forecast that I presented earlier. One thing about forecasts, everybody's got one. Ours is, I would argue probably the most aggressive out there. But if you look at the forecasts that have come from folks like ExxonMobil, and from others as well. They have been revising up their numbers on EVs, year over year. Not as high as ours, of course, but they're moving up as well. So I think there's a growing recognition that something's going on out there. And then you look at a company like Shell, which, for instance, has bought a charging infrastructure company. BP has invested in a charging infrastructure company as well. Some of the large oil majors are at least understanding that they want to hedge their bets on EVs. They may not necessarily buy that we're going to eliminate the need for crude oil, but they want to understand and be part of some of the revolution that's going on. This is a little tough from out here, but a little more detail on it. Like we think about 54% of cars that get sold in 2040 will be electric vehicles, and that will mean that about a third of the cars on the road by then would fall into that category. Obviously, it's based on a cost assumption and continued growth in this market going forward. A couple quick notes on it. We also do long-term forecasting around power demand. And so, of course, one of the first questions is, well, was this going to mean a massive growth in electricity demand? By our view, it's somewhere 5 to 8% of additional demand for electricity will be created by all of these new EVs. I realize it doesn't seem like that much, but they can be relatively efficient. And we also are forecasting that the growth in electricity demand overall won't be growing that much going forward, at least in developed countries. I'm just going to finish with one last point, which is that everything I showed you is basically our trying to look at, and I think Jan is going to talk a little bit more about this, about total cost of ownership for electric vehicles and thinking about the moment at which the consumer is sufficiently motivated that they want to buy an EV because when they walk into the dealership, either they do the math on total cost of ownership or they just look at the sticker prices and they go, wow, okay, the EV is cheaper, I want to buy that. But there's another aspect to it, and this is more of a personal note as somebody who has had a Nissan Leaf, leased for 4 years now. If you haven't actually driven an electric vehicle, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, a lot of people here, but it's a superior product to the combustion engine car. It's certainly a more pleasant experience and quieter to drive. It's got better acceleration, and I've had the car for 4 years. We've literally not spent like $10 on maintaining it other than to rotate the tires. And that's basically 100% city driving. So, I do think there is a qualitative aspect that at some point consumers will say, this is better. And I just show this slide just as a point of reference, which is that, sometimes adoptions of technology just go like this, a moment when consumers kind of recognize that it's something that's life-changing and life-improving. And this just looks at when different technologies were rolled out and then the rates of adoption. Some obviously took longer than others. And we don't know what the plot line will look like for electric vehicles on this, but it could be a much sharper rate up than even the one that I've predicted. Certainly our forecast has come under attack from time to time for being too aggressive. We've been attacked from time to time for being not aggressive enough as well. And so I think one of the questions that we'll really see is whether there's a qualitative aspect that drives all this forward even faster than we're anticipating. So with that, I'll hand it back to Carolee.
Thank you, Ethan. And I'd like to turn it now to Jan Yadigaroglu, who is managing principal of Capricorn Investment. He was an early investor in Tesla. He's also a Ceres board member. And not surprisingly, he is an EV proponent. And maybe you could talk to us a little bit about why you think EVs are going to win and some of the common misconceptions about EVs.
Good. Sorry, here, right?
Sorry.
Ooh.
There's Ethan, could you hand him the pointer?
Oh, I don't need that. But this is on?
Oh,
This is
yeah.
on.
No, you do need that for the slide.
Oh, I do. Okay, I click forward. Sorry, this is very technical for me. Yeah. So I just want to correct one thing, which is I don't feel that I'm an EV proponent, although in practice I am. I'm just an investor, and the bulk of the risk we take is venture capital risk, and I co-manage the Technology Impact Fund. So whatever I'm saying today, we put a lot of money behind. And so we, when our analysis fails, we lose money, and when our analysis is good, we make money, right? So that's really my agenda. And I think I'll just start with this because there's so much bad information circulating. I just wanted to, for those, in case you have been subject to bad information, there's absolutely no doubt that EVs are a net strong gain for energy and climate. So if you read anything to the contrary, it's just not a serious analysis. Any serious analysis that's looked at this says this is a tremendous gain for environment. And we have a version of it up there which cites some of the number of studies that have been done on this that are academically valid. And I spent 11 years as an academic, and so my job has shifted. I don't have the team that Ethan has to do research, but I still know what is fake news and what isn't, and this is not fake news, okay? This is real. The other thing is, Ethan mentioned the product's simply a better product. I think that is it's just absolutely true, and climate is clearly not the driver of uptake on EVs. It plays very little role with anyone buying an EV. And you're never, why you buy something is a psychological thing, and you never get truly academic, clear answers. But having looked at a lot of things, my hunch is that safety is actually number one. Especially in a lot of my context is biased by Tesla, obviously, because I've had a 14-year history with Tesla. And this is the curve which NISTA sent a cease and desist letter on when Tesla showed it. So automobile manufacturers get this curve, but NISTA hates that they ask you not to show it, and Tesla did. So I've seen more recent data, but I just can't share it. And what it shows, the reason they don't like this curve showed is that it shows that NISTA should have invented a new category for EVs only called 6 stars. And the difference, so if you're a 3-star rated car versus 4 stars versus 5, you have to have a 10% chance of serious injury in a crash, the way NISTA defines it. And these are correlated with actual deaths and injuries on the road. So this is not like random data. This is actually the probability of being severely injured and or dying in a car crash. So to get 5-star ratings, you have to be 10% or below. 4 stars, 15%. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but you're cutting out 1/3 of the probability of being in the same crash, right, of being injured by going from 4 to 5 stars. Well, an EV designed by a company that was doing this for the first time, which clearly does not have the same quality of engineering, and I mean this, as a BMW would have, achieved the lowest ever this is, again, scientifically valid result in crash testing. So there's a lot, again, of like voodoo out there on what's safe and what isn't safe. And, look, science is hard to do. This is the real gold standard in understanding car safety. And this is not, again, because their engineers are smarter or Elon's a genius. He is. But it's because of the fundamental fact that you don't have a really heavy engine in the front, a couple hundred kilos. You have instead a 500-kilo battery on the bottom and in the center of the car. It makes rollover almost impossible. It allows the front to actually act as a crumple zone in frontal crashes. And it also, and this is more complicated, removes a bunch of torque moments in crashes due to that weight being in the front where there's an offset crash. It also eliminates, by the way, fire risk. And that's all once the crash has happened. Before the crash has happened, the cars are fundamentally more dynamically stable because their center of gravity is distributed between the wheels and low. So you also have a lower chance of crashing in the first place. And that's also before autonomy, which of course is fundamentally a technique to avoid crashes. So crashes today, 1.2 million deaths a year, globally, 20 times that number of severe injuries, where severe defined in that the person will never recover fully from that injury, right? So if the healthcare costs alone of this are just staggering. And frankly, it's an embarrassment that we're allowing automobile industry to not do much about it. And look, I go hot and cold on automobile industry, but the fact is all the major innovations have been government mandated, and automobile industry typically has gone into these things kicking and screaming, whether it's airbags, seat belts, ABS systems. They were certainly often developed in cooperation with industry, but never adopted until government says, finished, the costs are too high, we're just going to mandate it. And so I think this is truly one of the big safety and healthcare opportunities the world has, and it's a major reason why EVs should be adopted beyond, and there are many others. So the simple fact is today, EVs are better cars on every attribute that matters to a consumer, safety being one, obviously performance being another, convenience. There still is this issue of the range anxiety, which really comes down to refueling time, right? It takes about 30, 40 minutes to refuel a car, an EV, with a rapid charger, and it takes 5, 6 minutes if it's diesel or gasoline. And that's being addressed. So supercharging is going from 100 to 300 kilowatts in terms of power. So you'll see that 30, 40 minutes drop to maybe 12 in the next couple of years. And then you will literally have no argument left, right? There will be no sales proposition. To come back to cost, my belief is that Tesla Model 3, and again, this argument is really broad, but I'm using Tesla because I understand the Tesla numbers the best. So don't take this as a Tesla advertisement. Tesla is simply a great company designing a great EV. The arguments are fundamental to any well-designed EV. Okay, this has nothing to do with the genius of Elon or Tesla or the engineers there. My belief is, and we have serious money riding on this, is that Tesla Model 3 is simply the cheapest car in the world to own operate. So of course EVs are cheaper to operate. You don't have to pay for the gasoline or diesel. You don't have to pay for maintenance. They last a long time. Things like electric motors never break. So there's all that. They're still a little more expensive because you have to buy that expensive battery system up front. But even there, it's starting to become scary, right? So a Model 3, most people will say, is comparably equipped to, let's say, a BMW 3 Series, to pick on one of my co-panelists. I'm trying to make this fun. And it's the same price, right? So if you look at a Model 3, it's dangerously close in pricing to its equivalent that is gas or diesel powered. It's not like you're paying twice the amount for it. And so of course, if you were paying the same price, then it would be cheaper overall in terms of total cost. This is a stronger argument that I'm making. I'm saying a Tesla Model 3 is cheaper to own and operate than a Toyota Yaris, right? Which costs, whatever, $10,000 to buy and burns no fuel. As long as you're using it regularly. If it sits in your garage, you're just burning capital and you're not using it. So of course that's expensive. But as long as you're using it 20, 30, 40,000 miles a year, it's actually cheaper. And voila. So that's, if you thought that there's a cost problem. So when Ethan says he gets criticism on both sides, I have absolutely, I'm willing to be embarrassed in the future. You can remember this, that I think our estimates are roughly twice as fast as Ethan's in terms of adoption rates. And here I'm just showing a little slide that OEMs have largely understood this. There's enormous problem because there's close to $1 trillion of plant and equipment, half of which out there, half of that again being in OEMs, half of that in suppliers. Half of all that again is related to diesel gas drivetrains. So this is a quite painful transition for automobile. Literally something like $500 billion has to get written off over the next 10 years. So that's a lot of money every year. Plus the same companies have to make $100 billion each just as a down payment to build new factories. So this is an astounding amount of industrial capacity that has to get reworked. And we've heard a few times about labor. My hunch is the real bottleneck is not even that, it's labor. The job intensity in drivetrain is greater even than it is with the rest of the car. And those jobs tend to be better jobs. You know, the guy that really machines the cylinder heads, that kind of manufacturing engineering job is really valued. And so if you're looking at countries like Germany, they're really going through a pretty gut-wrenching labor negotiation in terms of what are we going to do to retrain, displace, change all these jobs around, right? So that's, I think, the biggest bottleneck to adoption. So our adoption curves are not driven off cost or safety. I think that's already done. It's really how quickly can the industry re-industrialize and retrain and deal with the labor issue is the real constraint. And I think that's what I had in mind. Yes.
Thank you.
John.
Okay, well, there's John Walker from Lyft, who handles policy for Lyft. And Lyft has really been a leader in terms of integrating autonomous technology and electrification into its fleet, shall we say, in quotes. And so, John, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about those investments you're making and the efforts that Lyft is making to reduce the carbon footprint of its operations.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, my background was at Rocky Mountain Institute, which is an environmental think tank in Colorado, and now I'm at Lyft, of course, and talking about going from the realm of the possible at a think tank to trying to actually implement it, on the ground with Lyft. And so really what I want to talk about is the end of car ownership, because it's coming. And I think a lot of folks in this room have a say of whether we replace the cars with gas cars or with electric cars. And I'm going to talk a lot about what are the barriers and what are the levers we can pull there. So I like to start with this slide. You guys are, a lot of you are investors and deal with money all the time. There's Uber and Lyft and Ola and Didi. We make a lot of hay and a lot of the news. But this is the U.S. spend on mobility, and this middle bar is personal cars. So good for Tesla and good for Lisa and BMW. People spend $1 trillion in the U.S. alone per year owning and operating their cars. Right here is our spend on public transit. Most of it is subsidy. So everything involved in it. So tax and fees, financing, maintenance and repair, insurance, fuel, depreciation. All when you combine everything that you spend on your personal car, it's $1 trillion about. Then when you look at American spend on public transit, it's down here. When you look at American spend on rental cars, it's right here. And then right here, this little bar, this is taxi, which in this study, it was Uber and Lyft are considered taxis, limo, car share, et cetera. We're this little bar right here. So these stories of Uber and Lyft, dominating the market in big cities and things like that, we're not there yet, but we're going to get there. So what's wrong with, from the environmental perspective or from just a systems perspective, what's wrong with the status quo? We've gotten so used to everybody owning a car in this country and similarly in Western Europe that we just sort of forget that it's a pretty terrible system, right? So our vehicles are our second highest cost in this country, the highest cost for a low-income American, but they sit unused 96 or 95% of the time. They're just big paperweights most of the time. And they sit there, not only are they paperweights, they're depreciating paperweights. And like I say, they're the second highest expense for U.S. families, most for low income. They're dirty, 1.2 gigatons in the U.S. from CO2, NOx and SOx. They're super inefficient. So if there are any physicists in the room, less than 1% of the total energy that goes into a vehicle actually moves people, which is their purported use. So that's insane when you start to think about it. Poor use of land. We've got a billion parking spaces in this country, 4 spots for every vehicle. Terrible use of land. Half of a downtown core in a city can be devoted to parking. What if we could repurpose that for people instead of parking 2-ton paperweights? And then they're dangerous. Jan already talked about this, but 1 million people die every year, 37,000 in the U.S. I think it ticked up last year, which is really disturbing, even though vehicles are getting safer. So it's a bad status quo. So we're trying to move from ownership to ridership. I'm going to talk a little bit why that's better for all those bullets on the status quo. But we're not there yet. I mean, why are we? We're growing like crazy, but we're less than 1% of miles. So how are we going to take on $1 trillion industry? What's our biggest problem? Our biggest problem is we cannot compete on a per mile cost basis with a personal car. Yeah, it's the second highest or first highest expense for a family, but when you amortize that out over thousands and thousands of miles, it's about 60 cents a mile. We are about $2 to $3 a mile. So we are not right now a replacement for a personal car in terms of cost.
Who's we in that sentence?
We is us, Uber, Didi, Ola, TNCs. Yeah. So when I say we, I'm talking about the TNC industry in general. Yeah. And so this is from a study I worked on with a former colleague at RMI who's now with Waymo. But what we looked at was the cost. This is what I was just saying. This is taking Uber as an example. If I had known I was going to work for Lyft, I would have put Lyft here. But Uber at the time was about $2 a mile. A personal car, when you factor everything in, is about 70 cents a mile. And it's just not a good substitution. But automation, why did Travis call it automation existential for Uber? It's because of this chart. So it doesn't really matter in the end how expensive the autonomous system is. This is actually from Bloomberg, so thank you. But Bloomberg looked at a projection on autonomous technology to see where it could go, and this is an autonomous system that's maybe $50,000. But it doesn't matter when you compare it to the cost of a human driver. So if you can pop in this even if it's a super capital intensive autonomous system, you take out the human driver, wow, lo and behold, automated Uber or automated Lyft or automated Didi all of a sudden is comparable to a personal car. And what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that for the first time, maybe ever since the advent of the personal car, there is a convenient alternative to owning and operating a car that costs about the same. And so how is Lyft thinking about this? So Lyft has taken kind of a unique strategy when it comes to deploying AVs, and I'm biased, of course, but I think it's a pretty smart one. And what we're doing is it's called our open platform. And we are inviting the world's best autonomous vehicle companies to work with us to put their autonomous technology on our platform at a pace that they and the places they deploy are comfortable with. So for instance, we're working with Waymo in Phoenix. We're working with Nutonomy in Boston. If you're in Boston and you page a Lyft and you've opted in, you may get picked up by an autonomous electric Nutonomy vehicle. If you were at CES in Vegas, you might have taken a ride in our vehicle with Aptiv, who used to be Delphi. And it's done very well in the Strip. It was the first demonstration that had actual passengers without a predefined route. So we had 12 casinos or 12 hotels, but the vehicle actually used the Lyft software to navigate to the destination, which was a first. And it went extremely well, and we're going to expand that pilot to another city. Can't say which one yet. I was hoping I could at this panel, but not quite yet. Then we have a partner with Jaguar Land Rover. We have a partnership with Ford. Ford is building a car with no steering wheel for us. And so we want to be the platform that people put their technology on. And so we're looking for more partners. And by the way, we're also building our own autonomous vehicle just so that we're in the game no matter what, because this is such an important game. This is just kind of our sales pitch to the OEMs or to the car makers of why they should put it on. Because one thing I want to point out about our strategy is there are two ways that autonomous vehicle companies can deploy this technology. One, they can build enough vehicles that they can put them in a single market and have a critical mass that the system works. Or two, they could work with someone like us and put them on at their own pace. They could put 5 vehicles on in Phoenix and then just dispatch that vehicle for rides that it makes sense. And so it's a way to scale autonomous and learn a lot quickly as opposed to just trying to go and build a critical mass of level 5 vehicles and dump them into a single market. So that's our strategy. And this is our projection of how quickly this will take off. And actually, we're already exceeding this. So, right now, we're on pace. We're right here. Obviously, we're almost all human drivers. This isn't even quite fixed route. I mean, it's fixed destination, but we've had this Aptiv demonstration, this Nutonomy demonstration. We're starting to work on kind of limited scale. We think, by 2019, we're going to have autonomous vehicles that can operate in city environments without safety drivers, at least with one of our partners. And then by, let's just say 2020, 2021, we're going to have some level 5 vehicles on the road that can basically do whatever a human can do and do whatever a human can do much, much better. So this is our plan. You can see the interesting thing is I get asked a lot about, well, gosh, you talk a lot about your drivers. Aren't you going to have to fire all of them when the robots come? Well, the robots are coming slowly, and the robots are additive. And so we can add autonomous vehicles all day long, and then as the technology matures, we take our foot off the gas, pardon the pun, and the natural attrition of our drivers, 80-90% of our drivers are part-time drivers that are doing this temporarily. The natural attrition just goes like that. We'll never have to fire a single rideshare driver. So that's exciting to us who care about the driver community. And then oh, by the way, I love the chart of that shows the rise of color TV and the rise of computers. This chart doesn't contemplate a brand new industry formed and the employment implications of a brand new industry formed. Who's going to own the vehicles? Who's going to maintain them? Who's going to fuel them? Who's going to do all the things that we do? If you own a car, you have 2 jobs. You have your job and then parking, maintaining, fueling, insuring your vehicle. Someone else is going to take that when we move into a service and do all those things for you. Who's it going to be? It's a huge opportunity. So then when we project this out, and this is consistent with what Lyft thinks, this is from RMI when I was there, we actually think this is people buying cars, and here is what EIA thinks it's going to tick up and people are going to keep buying millions and millions of cars. I disagree. I think as soon as we have L5 autonomy with comparable cost and higher safety and higher convenience on a service like Lyft, people are going to stop buying cars and people are going to switch to automated mobility services, and we're going to reach sort of a parity of 6 million-ish of both being purchased. Now, the interesting thing is the mobility service vehicles will drive 10 times longer. So as Jan pointed out, what do we want to do in an electric vehicle? We want to drive the utilization up. So I'll get to electrification in a second, but when you have higher utilization of an autonomous vehicle, it makes a lot of sense to lower the operating cost at the expense of capital cost. So, and you can also note that if you add these two up, it doesn't reach even close to the EI projection. So there will be fewer vehicles, which is why you see the automotive industry scrambling to get a piece of this. Because we're not going to have 30 nameplates in 10 years. We're going to have 6 nameplates. And the auto industry, it wants to make sure they're within that 6 of the remaining nameplates. I'll say Tesla and BMW are going to be part of that. So that and I mean that truly. I think they actually will. All right. And so I want to talk about electric. That's what we're here to talk about, right? So autonomous Lyft is fantastic, but guess what? It works better with electric. And this is a study by LB&L. Maybe some of you have seen this, but I already talked about the cost. I totally agree with this 80% cost reduction. They actually found, gosh, it's not just cost, it's emissions. So 90% reduction in emissions if our fleet was electric autonomous vehicles powered by a renewable grid. And so that's quite an amazing result. And then so will automated Lyft be electric, right? That's a $1 billion or $1 trillion question. Yes. The question is just when, and it depends on a lot of stakeholders, and it depends on a lot of folks like you in the room. What are our challenges? We have capital cost challenges, and I totally agree with Jan that if you look at 200,000 miles on a Model 3, it's a no-brainer. But when we look at this, we're not comparing a brand new EV versus a brand new Ford. We're comparing it to a 2-year-old Hyundai Sonata that Hertz can get off of an auction for $4,000, right? And so when the gasoline vehicles that our drivers can get are so low in capital, even if fuel is zero, which it's not in a lot of places, especially fast chargers in California, it's hard for us to make that up. And so we have a challenge with capital cost. Operating cost of EVs is a challenge. RMI did a study and they found that in California, fast charge can be more expensive than gasoline because of demand charges and low utilization. So there actually is an operating cost problem. And our friends at Tesla, I'll just take one dig at Tesla, just sent us a letter that says, oh, your drivers can no longer charge at the supercharge stations. So that's unfortunate. That's very unfortunate. And we're hoping that Elon changes his mind on that. If you could put in a good word for us, we'd love that. But we have challenges on operating EVs. And then there's an infrastructure problem of not enough infrastructure if we're going to scale quickly. And then what I also will say is that people say, well, why don't you just make your drivers buy EVs? Our drivers are largely low income. They identify as low income. And if you look at the Venn diagram of our drivers, and you look at the Venn diagram of people who organically buy EVs, that overlap is about 0.1%. So our drivers are not the people that buy EVs because of credit, cost, fueling. And so we need to address these barriers if we're going to make autonomous service vehicles electric quickly. And so I implore all of you let's have a discussion to think about how we can fill that gap between overcoming some of these barriers. So that's it.
Great. Well, thanks so much, John. And last but not least, we have Lisa Errion, who's a VP for Government Affairs for BMW. And BMW has been a leader among the legacy automakers. They just sold 100,000 EVs last year. And Lisa, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your investments in electrification, autonomous technology, and shared mobility.
Sure. Hi. I think being last and also being here as representing an automaker, it's my job to talk a little bit about with all these exciting developments, what does an established automaker, how does an established automaker look at today and look at the future and our current business and where we're going. So I'll just say that BMW is 101 years old now, and that means we have a strong heritage. And we've proven track record of innovation and reacting to change. And one thing that's true about BMW is it's a passionate company that builds that's passionate about the vehicles that it builds, and that won't change and is not changing. We're actually looking ahead, looking today and ahead at what we're seeing, and we're excited and we're innovating just as always. So I think that we look at what's happening today, and we look at the technology, and we're pioneering new technologies, and we're trying to shape the change in the industry, being part of the industry, and we have identified. I think everybody has the same basket, and people call it different things. ACEs: automated, connected, electric, and shared. And those are the themes that we use when we look ahead. And when if you're an established company, you have today's business model that you have to continue to operate as you develop and execute on tomorrow's business model. And we are doing that mindfully and very consciously. And we've made some announcements about how we're going to be able to have the same production lines with different drivetrains, being drivetrains that are electric or plug-in hybrid, and those that are running on combustion engines. Because again, one of the things that, with all the trends that we're seeing and that have been talked about, all these changes are happening at different rates, different places, at different speeds, and so we will be operating our business and making all those changes for the future. So let me just make a few general comments and then and talk a little bit about what we see as drivers for this change and what are some of the barriers. So in the area of sustainable mobility, electromobility, as Carolee mentioned, in 2017, BMW sold 100,000 battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. By 2019, we expect to have 500,000 of these vehicles on the road by the end of 2019. And our projections for 2025 is that up to 25% of our annual global vehicle sales will be electric. So we are, we're there already, and we're going to be offering more models. By 2025, we will have 25 either full or semi-electric models, 12 of which will be fully electric. And so we have a very robust line of offering coming forward. When we think about the flexibility in production and for new vehicle architectures, that's critical for again, some of the subjects that were raised in terms of labor and existing in invested capacity and industrial capacity, that we will be able to take our existing production facilities and adapt them so that we can produce the amount and the range and the variety of electric vehicles that we want to have in the same production facilities, with, of course, strong investment, but it's not. It's about growing what we have and not reducing it. For us, electromobility is the new normal. If you look at anything that the company talks about, the future is electric, and we know that. And I'm not sure about others in the industry, but for BMW, that is absolutely at the core. When it comes to autonomous, another one of our core future projects, current projects, we are working very hard on that. We have, and it's not just the autonomous driving itself, but it's the services and the ecosystem around it. And we have partnerships, and for a company, those are critical. We have partnerships with Intel and Mobileye, and we are very serious about this. When John, when you mentioned that as soon as we have L5 autonomy, that doesn't seem quite as a no-brainer to a company like BMW. We don't, there's a lot of challenges, and maybe I will briefly shift into drivers and barriers that we identify in the policy space or in the public policy space. So, obviously drivers for change are societal trends. People want to share. People are getting accustomed to that. Having digital access promotes the ability to do that. And of course, environmental. Goes without saying, lowering greenhouse gases, curbing pollution, congestion. All of those things are definitely drivers for change in the mobility sector. Some of the barriers are when it comes to comprehensive mobile coverage. So when we talk about autonomous driving, those vehicles have to be able to to communicate with each other without gaps in service. We can't have dropped calls when you have your autonomous cars speaking to each other. So connectivity and local governments, local authorities are key to that. When it comes to traffic flow, parking, all of those realities that you have to have when you're operating an autonomous fleet. Legal and liability issues are barriers that have to be grappled with. Liability, obviously, but legal and privacy issues, all the data that gets thrown off, who owns it, how do you control it, how do you keep from having attacks. Safety and security are huge drivers for this technology, but also the public. There are studies that show that public confidence is not there yet, and so there has to be real effort put in by all the players in autonomous to make the public understand and believe that autonomous vehicles can be safe and rely upon. When it comes to incentives, we're not there yet, where this has also been developed by other speakers, but that people are not either able to or are not making a choice today without incentives to buy electric vehicles. That I hope will change, but the reality today is in some countries in Europe, when incentives were removed, the share went down. And then, finally, framework conditions. These are all framework conditions, but when it comes to public charging infrastructure, this is something that, again, to build public confidence and overcome range anxiety, which is, I'm sure there'll be a pharmaceutical for that, but that we'll all see advertised with a lot of fast talk on television. But having, the ability for public charging is something that is critical to there being growth. So. I hope that's just a few comments from an incumbent player in the industry who isn't resting, but is looking ahead, and we definitely are going to be one of those 5 nameplates. John, thanks very much for that confidence. Yeah.
I just want to ask one follow-up question for the panel, and I hope you'll feel free to respond to each other as well. UC Davis recently came out with a study saying that in order to ensure the reduction of carbon emissions from the sector, we need to ensure that all cars are shared, autonomous, and electric. And I'd just like people to react to the barriers and drivers of that. And I also want to insert some additional context from today. As many of you know, the Trump administration is talking about rolling back the CAFE standards. And today, Administrator Pruitt told the Senate that he indicated that he's interested in revoking California's ability to set its own standards as well as its ZEV program, which has been adopted by 12 other states. So about a third of the U.S. vehicle market is subject to that. And this would obviously have a hugely negative impact on emissions from the sector and the uptake of EVs. So if you'd like to fold in your thoughts on that as well. Maybe we start with John and just go down the line. Okay.
Yeah, very, very unfortunate with the announcement from Pruitt. But at least from the Lyft perspective, our average fleet fuel economy is better than the fleet itself, and that's because even though most of our drivers are just driving a vehicle they already own on the margin, there are 2.6 vehicles per family in the U.S. And typically our drivers choose the most fuel-efficient vehicle from their family to drive on the Lyft platform because it's a no-brainer. They spend less on fuel, and they're typically smaller vehicles, so they spend less on maintenance. So our fleet is naturally a little bit better than the typical fleet. So that's a good news. On the shared side, so yeah, love Dan Sperling and UC Davis, worked on some of the 3 Revolutions stuff with him. with both my hats on at Lyft and previously, but we're already doing shared. So we already have a much higher load factor than personal vehicles. We have a pooling option where we're putting strangers in the same vehicle. If you're in San Francisco and you do it, you might get triple matched now. It's getting really effective in San Francisco. I was triple matched in a Chevy Bolt, and I took a photo of it because I was so happy about it. And so we're there. We're getting there with sharing. We're starting to see more and more people take Lyft line, which is really exciting. And the more mature a market is, the more Lyft line. So sharing is coming, even with older folks. You know, when we first launched it, people said, okay, yeah, the college kids will do it. We're starting to see, 40-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 65-year-olds, 70-year-olds do Lyft line and really enjoy it. So I think we're going to see a big uptake in sharing. On the electric, I already talked about that. We'd love to have electric. We have some challenges with capital cost in our driver base. And then on the autonomous, like I said, that's our existential strategy. So.
Thank you.
No, just maybe I'll just few thoughts that come to mind. Certainly, the caution that John gave around some detail, things like capital costs, those are important detail. That's all obviously very real. So I like to focus on the fundamentals because if you look at 5 or 10 years ahead, a lot of the detail gets sorted out along the way, but some of that detail is super important. Maybe another point of caution is you've heard about sharing of rides, you've heard about dispatchability, electrification, autonomy. They're all different things, and there are complicated interactions between those. And some of this is well understood, some of it's not. Autonomy may, for instance, promote or do the opposite in terms of car ownership. There's a lot of complicated stuff going on. So I think it's a really rich space, well worthy of your intellectual interest, because a lot of this will have important ramifications for your investments, even if they're public company investments, but all the way down the chain. I don't know what to say about ZEV credits. Look, the truth is, whenever there's really bad news, you have to put it into perspective. There's the things we're looking at, which are Moore's Law kind of change over decades, cannot be held back by bad policy. And good policy can accelerate, and because of the climate and other challenges we have, it's just distressing when you don't see government on board helping and trying to do the opposite. But in the U.S., clearly, to state the obvious, Tesla had taken a very strong leadership role in kind of getting the whole industry behind this. And the incumbents have their own advantages, and Tesla has been the biggest beneficiary of the ZEV program. And they're going to run out of ZEV credits anyway, right? So if you look at something like that, sure, we can get all worked up about it, but it's going to make basically no difference, in my opinion, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess.
Yes.
there
So
are other-
sorry, I don't want to be quoted saying that. Of course, we should have
Other
good policy.
manufacturers, Other states
Yes.
will benefit from it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, but it's not clear they need it, right? So do you need ZEV to get Ford on board or not? I mean, some of this stuff becomes academic, and it's all going in the wrong direction. But there's kind of no stopping the flood, right? The flood is coming, and so I try to ignore the daily news because that just bogs you down. Yeah.
I guess one, maybe trying to follow on that a little bit, which is I do think that well, first, I mean, we'll see what happens. And of course, I'm sure California will sue the hell out of the federal government, and then this will go on, and it might drag on through the balance of the Trump first term. By the time it all gets resolved, that seems to be often what happens. It's a lot of legal wrangling. But I do think from from in terms of where policy meets the road is that, if in fact, so ZEV credits have allowed this industry to scale up, which has allowed costs to come down, which has allowed, a lot of progress to take place, and has also allowed Tesla and some other U.S. manufacturers to take hold in the U.S. If let's suppose that the ZEV credits and the CAFE standards are effectively waived off by the current administration, I totally agree that there's an inevitability about this. It just means that China is going to be the one that is going to develop the technologies and just keep going, because basically they've made an order over there to get more EVs on the road. And let's just say that they don't have 4 years of lawsuits that typically go into, questions of regulation. It just happens. And so it just strikes me that this would be a kind of a critical juncture from a U.S. competitive perspective, a really bad time to take our foot off the gas in terms of supporting this industry.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think 43% of EVs were manufactured in China last year as opposed to 17% in the U.S., so we're already behind. Lisa?
Well, I mean, as I said, for us, the future is electric, and we've clearly stated that. So I think what any industry player needs is some level of certainty in order to make plans and to operate. I hope that that's not true what he said, the secretary. But I think it's just important to keep focused on the goals and to develop the products and offer them, and to work with partners to be sure that there's uptake. I mean, one of the things that we are, like I said, consciously shifting from being a mobility provider, if you will, to a tech company that provides mobility and services. And you have to partner with local governments and state governments, and so especially in cities, that's really important. And there's variety in terms of consumer demand, and I think it's not that California is unique, and that partnering with California to come up with solutions that meet their consumers, that will hopefully allow the cities in California to be demonstration effect for others, and then to have a better uptake in the U.S. as a whole is something that we're trying to find the best partnerships to do that. So I mean, yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
Sure.
And I apologize, everyone. We only have about 5 minutes for audience questions, but please. Go ahead.
I'd love to hear more about the role of government, any government, in facilitating and expediting the process you're talking about. I've read about the cities in China which are apparently rationing the number of ICE licenses, and there are other countries, I think, that have said they're going to cease manufacturing and sale of ICE vehicles at some known date. It seems to me those are extraordinarily powerful tools in the right hands, which we might count on in 4 years here, and maybe not, but can you say something about government role?
I'm happy to. So I think it's very context dependent. And so if you go to places that are still growing and building a ton of infrastructure, take India being the most obvious. Look, they've all seen the curves. India has no interest in subsidizing the long-term future of EVs, but they've seen that it's not just an environmental argument, it's literally an affordability argument at this point. So if your bureaucrats understand that, then it becomes logical to announce it so that the entire industry organizes around that idea and doesn't build the wrong infrastructure, right? It makes no sense to build more refineries in India or more fueling stations or more carburetor factories, right? So I think that statement in India should be understood that way, saying there will be no cars post-2030 that aren't EVs is a way to tell people, please don't make the wrong investments. In Germany, I think there's more of a deliberate negotiation around that industrial and labor issue. And so getting all of the manufacturers on board and synchronizing that transition and doing it hand in hand with labor, and I mean, that's sort of the big deal there. U.S. has its own variants of that. Obviously, another big battleground for the labor issue. Some of the solvency of some of the companies in question. There are real subsidies that are still available, and they create different competitive dynamics. So I think, again, depending on the context, there's a different role. But, of course, good government and good policy makes a difference. Over 10 or 20 years, it will happen either way. But hopefully we have the right people in government working.
And we also have the urgency of moving quickly in light of what's happening with the climate. Please.
Sure. Lisa, you mentioned about public charging infrastructure. And I wonder if you could say more, perhaps characterize that you're seeing? What kind of interaction is a kind of car-making company having with local utility players? Kind of maybe pulling on what Geisha said a little bit at lunch, and also.
Unfortunately, I missed Geisha's because we had to come down here, but yeah. Yeah.
In brief, she just
Right.
mentioned that certainly PG&E is going to have a role in charging infrastructure, but since you have such a global view, can you characterize how different countries perhaps are dealing with building out charging infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, for in the U.S., we have a program called Charge Now with PGE, and it's a program where we, the user has an app, and they bring their car home in the evening and they plug it in, and they need, and at some point, based on the demand, it'll charge. So that's a great for us. That's a great partnership to have. For us, California is our biggest incubator or place where we're doing innovation. I'm afraid I can't talk about the rest of the. I'm in charge of the Americas. The U.S. is kind of the big one there. So I won't be able to talk about the rest of the world with any authority. Sorry about that.
Back here?
So we're all investors. What is the ecosystem, aside from charging stations, in which we can invest to make this future happen while we make money and to make it happen? What private are you looking at? What public? Who's doing a good job? How do we find the Levi's and the pickaxe manufacturers for the gold rush rather than the gold rush itself, which you guys have all done already?
I could chime in there. I think the missing piece for us is who is going to own and operate the autonomous vehicles of the future. We like owning electrons and not steel, right? And so we're an app company at the end of the day. Who's going to own and operate hundreds of thousands or millions of electric autonomous vehicles, house them, fuel them, clean them, deploy them? That's a huge opportunity. And the de facto, I think, will be the car dealerships or the rental car companies. But could someone have a startup that has some of the advantages of not having an existing business model and sunk costs like Hertz does or something like that?
Jan?
Sure. So, just orders of magnitude, the charging part in developed country where we have full mature grids is really not material in terms of dollars. There's an interesting opportunity everywhere, but you'll have a hard time finding Tesla's spend on the supercharger network in their P&L statements, and yet there are thousands. It's hard to drive now 100 miles in the U.S. without crossing a supercharger, right? So it's great business for utilities. They're loving it. It's one of the few sources of new demand for electricity in America. They're well equipped to be good partners in rollout of additional charging points. So I think that is now in countries that don't have good electric grids. That is a huge bottleneck, and that's a lot of investment. By far, the biggest industrial problem here is the battery, by far. So the world needs dozens of gigafactories in batteries. It's a major, major industrial opportunity. Behind that, you have motors and power electronics. Those were the bottlenecks 14 years ago, and they still are the largest industrial problems for EVs. The rest of the car, a lot of it is, the same that we already have. So the so-called flyers are not that different. But certainly power electronics and controllers, motors, and by far the biggest one being battery factories. We need probably, several $100 billion worth of battery factories. I don't want to give a precise number, but that's sort of the order of magnitude.
Thank you, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our great panelists.